Hello, and welcome to Why Do Countries Exist, Episode 3, Albania. Albania is our first country in the Balkans, and like many countries in the Balkans, it is stereotyped as being very poor, being very nationalistic online, and whose historical achievements really consist of slaughtering other ethnic groups in the region. And now, while that is too much of an overgeneralization to be true, Albania is one of the poorest countries in Europe. You can very easily find Albanians yelling at Serbians, Greeks, Bulgarians, Macedonians, or Montenegrins online about Albanian history, but why is that? Albania is located right on the Adriatic Sea. The sea forms its western border, with the country of Montenegro to the northwest, the disputed state of Kosovo to the northeast, the Republic of North Macedonia to the east, and Greece to the southeast. Albania is another very mountainous state, although they are also known for their beautiful beaches along the Adriatic. Albania is made up of the titular ethnic group, the Albanians, making up somewhere between 90 to 97% of the country. Smaller ethnic groups of Greeks, Romani, and Macedonians also exist, generally around the borders of Albania. Most Albanians speak the Albanian language, which interestingly enough is an independent branch of the Indo-European language family, meaning it doesn't really have any other languages close to it and is a fairly complex language. However, there is a dialect divide between the language, with northern Albanians speaking the Geg Albanian and southern Albanians speaking Tosk Albanian. Albania is notable for being one of the few areas in Europe where Islam is the majority religion, with almost 60% of the population practicing some form of Islam. However, there are large religious minorities, with roughly 10% being Catholic Christian, who are mainly based in the north, and 7 to 20% being Eastern Orthodox Christian, who are mainly based in the south, with Eastern Orthodoxy being closely connected to the Greek minority. There's also roughly 20 to 30% of the population who are irreligious. Albania is broadly considered to be a fairly secular state, with most Albanians placing their ethnicity and culture above their affinity to religion. Albanians are also noted for having a large community outside the country, with the lands holding large numbers of Albanians forming a region known as Greater Albania. In almost all the neighboring states, there exists a significant Albanian community. The unrecognized state of Kosovo is almost entirely Albanian, with 88% of the population being Albanian and being formed by these Albanians living in the region fighting against Serbian rule. North Macedonia has around 25% of the population being ethnically Albanian. Within the country, there is significant tension and an on and off again insurgency taking place in the western part of the country since the 90s, with Albanian nationalists attempting to break away and join Albania. Countries close by, like Serbia, Montenegro, Croatia, Greece, and Italy, and even as far away as Germany, the UK, Sweden, and Turkey, all hold large Albanian minorities. Even though Albania itself holds 2.5 million Albanians, it is believed another 5 to 8 million live outside the country. Albanian history generally starts with the Illyrian people. The Illyrian peoples were a group of tribes located throughout the Eastern Balkans, starting from roughly 2000 BCE until the 600s CE. They often harassed the ancient Greeks in the south until the Romans came in the late 200s BCE and invaded the region. The connection between the Illyrians and the Albanians is dubious and debated among scholars, but often plays an important role in developing the national myth for Albania. It is believed to have developed as early as the 2nd century, with a tribe known as the Albanoi being mentioned by the Greek historian Ptolemy. Albania would remain in the Roman Empire until 1395, when it was given over to the Byzantine/Eastern Romans, where it suffered from barbarian invasions starting with the Goths and Huns during the 360s, the Slavs in the 600s, and ending with the Bulgars in the 840s. The Slavs are believed to have mixed with the remaining Illyrians in the region, along with the Greeks and Thracians, another ancient Balkan ethnic group that the Albanians are debated to be descended from. The Albanian ethnicity and language really developed at this time, with the Albanians making up the majority of the region. Christianity had taken hold in the region at this time, with the current North Catholic and South Orthodox divide being created in the 1000s, with those in the south having greater connections to the Greeks and those in the north having greater connections to the Italians. The first Albanian state would also be formed, with the Principality of Arbanon holding autonomy in the Byzantine Empire from 1190 to 1216. The second Albanian state, the Kingdom of Albania, was formed in 1272. It was controlled by the Angevin kings of Sicily and was primarily used by them to try and spread Catholicism in the region and increase the prestige of the Angevins. Byzantine expeditions and Albanian warlords would eventually force the Angevins out of the country by 1368. One important thing to note is the Albanian customs called the kuna. Kuna are a series of unwritten cultural laws in dealing with both governance and the customs of the Albanians, particularly those in the more mountainous and isolated parts of the country. The kunon broadly gave individual towns and local communities widespread autonomy and even gave some measure of civil liberty, with all males, note that females are not included, given the ability to participate in the decision-making process and have a say in how things ought to be run. This gave Albanians a strong sense of loyalty to their community and an expectation of being heard and respected. Many Albanians would force local rulers to either respect their quasi-Albanian self-rule, or be forced to deal with rebellion and insurgency from their mountainous communities. Infamously, the Kuna also includes the tradition of jakmaria, or blood-taking. Jakmaria allows men to murder other men who they believe have wronged them in some way. This feud can last for several generations, as it is believed the crimes of the father will pass on to their sons if the debt is not resolved. This often leads to brutal murders between different family male members. The Kuna, while largely popular among many of the Albanians in the interior of the country, was either loosely followed or largely ignored by many of the more urban and coastal areas of the country. The remaining Middle Ages would prove to be a fragmented time in Albanian history, with various Italians, Slavs, Greeks, and Albanian lords fighting over the region until the arrival of the Ottomans in 1395. The Ottomans would eventually take over the entire region by 1431. They would seek to implement centralized rule in the region, bringing with them both Turkic military troops and administrative officers, introducing Islam to the region, and sought to increase taxes on the Albanians, notably with the jizya, that was a yearly tax towards all non-Muslims in the empire. This would create tension with many of the local lords in Albania. In 1432, one of the first major revolts would break out that would ultimately end in disaster. After this, the Ottomans would relax some of their policies and give greater autonomy to the lords that embraced their rule. This would include one George Castrioni Skanderbeg. Skanderbeg was a part of the Albanian nobility that had grown close with the Ottomans when they first entered the region. He had received military training from the Ottomans and would aid them in several battles against Christian states to the north during the 1430s and 40s. He proved to be very talented, rising through the ranks reaching as high as Sanjak Bey, which to my understanding is pretty much a district governor, in 1440. He ignored requests to participate in the 1432 rebellion from his father and remained loyal to the Ottomans. However, after the death of his father in 1437, several of his father's old lands would be taken away from his family. This, along with the Ottomans attempting again to use centralized rule in Albania, led him to desert the Ottoman cause in 1443 during the Battle of Nils. Skanderbeg would lead his Ottoman rebels to take a small but significant part of northern Albania, basing his rebellion in the city of Kruja. There, Skanderbeg and several other feudal lords would form the League of Legia in 1444, which would resist Ottoman rule in the region for 30 years. Skanderbeg would constantly lead smaller Albanian forces to victory against large Ottoman armies, using his years of experience with the Ottomans against them. The Albanians received assistance from the French, Venetians, after fighting a conflict with them in the late 1440s, and many local Christian non-Albanian lords who were opposed to Ottoman rule. However, with Skanderbeg's death in 1468, the Albanian rebels now led Lek Dugajingi began retreating and losing territory until by 1478 the Ottomans had captured Kruja, ending the rebellion. While he failed to defeat the Ottomans, Dugajingi was most famous for codifying many of the Kuna and helping create semi-standardized law throughout the Albanian highlands. These laws would later be written down during a rise in Albanian nationalism in the 1800s. The Ottomans now fully controlled Albania and recognized that their previous form of governance had been disastrous. Ottomans sought to use a form of autonomy to control the Albanians. While Albanians could keep their highlands culture, they were not allowed to hold strong nationalistic ideas. The greater Albanian area was divided among 8 sanjaks, which is Turkic for district, to make it harder for the Albanians to unite, with the governors of these sanjaks often coming from local Albanian families and ruling them as puppet states for the Ottomans. Islam was spread by the Ottoman rulers in hopes of converting the Albanians to Islam and thus strengthening their ties to the empire. While many Albanians did convert, it is also important to note that for many Albanians, religion is secondary to their culture. The Ottomans also increased the benefits of aiding them and tried to recruit many Albanians into the Ottoman bureaucracy. Perhaps most famously was Muhammad Ali Pasha, who would, with a small but powerful military force, take control of Egypt in the early 19th century. Albanians' anger towards the Ottoman rule started back up towards the 1830s. Several events such as the massacre of tribal Albanian leaders, several failed peasant revolts, a failure to modernize with the new industrial revolution sweeping across Europe, and Albanian attempts to try their hand in centralization again, kicked off the Albanian national revival. The revival led to the Albanian alphabet being standardized, Albanian art and literature being encouraged, created, and celebrated, and a strong sense of nationalism forming in the Albanians. Nationalism was on the rise all throughout Europe, and especially in many of the other nations in southeastern Europe, with many of them forming independent states. Soon, Albanians themselves began talking about forming an independent state, although pro-Ottoman sentiment remained strong in many parts of the country. In 1912, many of the newly independent Balkan states joined together and invaded the dying Ottoman Empire, and easily won the First Balkan War. This war weakened the Ottomans so much that they could no longer hold on to most of their European territories, and Albania gained its independence on November 28, 1912. However, the first years of independence proved to be bloody. Many Albanians who wished to be a part of Albania found themselves outside the new state, and many of its neighbors considered Albanian land to be a part of their territory. While full-blown war did not break out, ethnic violence around the borders was very common, brutal, and bloody. particularly with the Greeks in the south, who formed the Autonomous Republic of Northern Epirus in hopes of being annexed by Greece. The very little order that was found in Albania completely collapsed with the pro-Ottoman peasant revolt in 1914 that gripped the entire country, the German prince who was supposed to rule the country fleeing from it, and the start of World War I. While Albania didn't join either side in the war, it was a battleground in the conflict, as the Greeks, Italians, Serbians, Austro-Hungarians, and Bulgarians would take parts of the region, fighting each other along with various Albanian tribesmen and militias. The end of the war didn't bring stability, as even though Albanian borders were more defined, other states still remained hostile towards Albania, and political tension within the country was high. In 1925, Ahmet Muhar, a politician in Albania, who had been forced to leave the country the previous year after a revolt, returned. With assistance from conservative elements in the country, along with aid from the Yugoslavs, Zog managed to take control of the country and was proclaimed president. After 3 years of brutal dictatorial rule, Zog was declared King of Albania. Zog's rule would be noted for his authoritarianism, limited attempts at modernization, his close relations with fascist Italy, possibly being the heaviest smoker in history having over 200 cigarettes a day, and his eccentric personality. Fun fact, apparently Zog had around 600 different blood feuds against him, with over 50 attempts to assassinate Zog while he ruled Albania. Zog's rule and close relationship with fascist Italy would come to an end in 1939 with the Italian invasion of the country. The Italian claimed Albanians were linked by the Romans to the modern-day Italians, somehow, and that Albania was rightfully Italian land. It also had a more practical value of being a future staging area against the Yugoslavs and the Greeks. In 1940, the Italians would invade Greece through Albania, but would be pushed back, and it wouldn't be until German troops aided the Italians in 1941 that the Axis powers took full control of Greece. Resistance to Axis rule came from 3 different factions. The first faction were the Royalists. These were conservatives who wished to bring Zog back on the throne. They were backed by the Western powers of the UK and America, but received very little support on the ground. The second faction were the nationalists known as the Balkan. They wanted a state where Albanian culture and language were respected, and all Albanians united under a single state. The third and largest force were the Communist National Liberation Movement. Communism in Albania initially started off weak due to Zog's brutal means of repression, but quickly gained strength with the aid of Soviet agents who wanted to start communist insurrections behind Axis lines. They were led by partisan Enver Hoxha. In 1943, with the Italians switching sides in the war, the Germans quickly rushed to take control of Albania. They aligned with the Balkan, in exchange for giving Albania greater autonomy. They united to fight the communists. However, with aid from communists in Yugoslavia, Albanian communists managed to take control of the country by the end of the war, with Hoxha leading the new communist-controlled People's Socialist Republic of Albania. It quickly formed close ties with Stalin's Soviet Union. Albania began to modernize more now than under any previous government. Illiteracy was eliminated from most of the male population. Massive land reforms instituted, income increased, and infrastructure improved. However, Hoxha also executed any who opposed him, tried to end many of the laws and cultural traditions of the Kuna for being backwards, and now religion was outlawed, with atheism being declared the state religion, with many religious figures forced to go underground. Albanians' foreign policy during the Cold War led it to being isolated. They remained hostile with their neighbors the Greeks, who were still unhappy with Albanian support for the communist rebels during the civil war in the 40s, and the Yugoslavs. Yugoslavia was also communist, but they were hostile towards the Soviet Union, complaining of the Soviets interfering in their country. The Albanians, along with the rest of communist Eastern Europe, sided with the Soviets, thus cutting off relations with the Yugoslavs. However, in 1953, with the death of Stalin, Hoxha cut relations with the Soviets for attempting to mend relations with the Yugoslavs, and their policies of de-Stalinization under Nikita Khrushchev being seen as too reformist. Hoxhaism, the ideology of Albanian communists, was strongly opposed to revisionist versions of Marxism that tried to move communist states away from the ideological positions of Stalinism. The Albanians, now having no allies in Europe, turned to the People's Republic of China for friends. The Chinese under Mao had been growing hostile towards the Soviets over border disputes and different views of Marxism. However, this relationship would break down in the 70s after Nixon's visit to China improved relations between America and China. By the mid-70s, Albania was left with no friends anywhere and were surrounded by hostile states. Hoxha grew increasingly paranoid and began preparing Albania for an invasion from an unclear enemy. Around 170,000 bunkers were built around Albania, with it being one of the most famous symbols for Albanian communism. In 1985, Hoxha died. Albanians, led primarily by the youth and students who wanted greater economic opportunities and political freedom, began protesting in late 1990. The first multi-party elections were held in 1991, which were won by the Communists, but the next election, in 1992, resulted in a victory for the Democratic Party, or PD, a center-right conservative party. The country opened up with the economy transitioning into a capitalist market economy, with foreigners and Albanians allowed to enter and leave the country as they saw fit, and greater political freedom for the average person. However, there would also be problems in the new system, with the Albanian government placing very little restrictions on the economy and giving rise to Ponzi schemes, with companies telling people to invest thousands of dollars into various schemes and then taking all their money. Many of these schemes ended up disproportionately hurting the rural poor. In 1997, the schemes collapsed, with $1.2 billion being lost. Many people lost their entire life savings, and violence broke out across the country. The government, backed by PD supporters and militias from northern Albania, a stronghold of the PD, fought against protesters and defecting troops supported by the opposition Socialist Party, or PS. PS, a center-left social democrat party, was made up primarily of former communists, and was also backed by militias from southern Albania, which is a stronghold of the PS. While less than 5,000 people died in the fighting, it resulted in economic ruin for many Albanians and started the process of mass immigration out of Albania. In June 1997, PS won the parliamentary election that year and started the process of reforming the country, attempting to tackle corruption and reforming the economic and judicial system. Albania has since seen moderate progress, with the GDP increasing and the average Albanian broadly being better off today than they were 20 years ago. PS and PD remain the two largest parties, with them often being in power on and off again. Smaller political parties also remain relevant, such as the Nationalist, Party of Justice, Integrity and Unity, or the Social Democratic, Socialist Movement for Integration, typically playing a role aiding one of the larger parties, either helping them form a government or forming part of the opposition. Right now, PS leader Edi Rama is the prime minister of the country, with him investing further into the justice system, fighting unemployment, and increasing Albania's presence on the world stage. Both PS and PD are in favor of Albania joining the EU and are supportive of NATO, which Albania joined in 2008. It is important to note that Rama's government has been accused of corruption and electoral fraud in the 2017 election by the opposition parties, which the government has denied. So why does Albania exist? Albania has always historically been behind a lot of their neighbors and have suffered through economic and political hardship, but they remain proud of their country and their traditions. They continue to push forward despite the many difficulties facing their country. Albanians are a very honorable and fiercely independent people, and no matter what happens, they will fight to maintain their honor and independence. Even Albanians outside the country share in this zeal, with many hoping to form a state consisting of all the land Albanians form a majority or significant minority in. Albanians are unwilling to be ruled by any foreign power, and this ensures the survival of Albania. The next country is our first African country, Algeria. Prepare for butchered Arabic, Berber, lots of invasions, and pirates. My email is whydocountries@gmail.com. If you have any comments, questions, concerns, or hate mail, please send it my way. Thank you, and I will see you next week. The sources I used for this video are the Center for Islamic Pluralism's article, The Influence of Ottoman Rule on Albanian Political Sociology, Geography Now's video, Albania, Gerald Kunis's documentary, The Albanian Renaissance, Kings and Generals documentary, Ottoman Wars, Skanderbeg and the Albanian Rebellion, Mesa Man's video, The Albanians, Europe's Original White Muslims, Mr. History's video, A Super Quick History of Albania, Rare Earth's video, The Pyramid Scheme That Collapsed a Nation, The Great Wars videos, The Game of Thrones in Albania during World War I, and King Zog Out of the Ether, and finally, Wikipedia.